In the year 1979, David Mitchell lived a quiet life in a small American town. He was not a rich man, nor was he famous. He worked an ordinary job, lived in a modest house, and kept to himself most of the time. Yet inside him was a heart filled with something greater than money or fame, a deep compassion for children who had no one to love them. For many years, David had volunteered at local shelters and children's homes. He had seen the loneliness in the eyes of children who moved from one foster home to another. He had seen how some of them stopped believing in promises because they had been broken too many times. Among them were children who felt invisible, as if the world had no place for them. Each time David left those shelters, he carried their faces in his heart. One day, during one of his visits, he met 9 little girls. They were sisters by heart, not by birth, but they shared a common story: they had been left behind by the system. Some had been separated from their families, others had never known stability. Their ages ranged from toddlers to young schoolgirls. When David first saw them sitting together quietly, something stirred in him. They were not noisy or playful like other children, they sat with cautious eyes, waiting for what would happen next. The director of the home told David that it was unlikely the girls would ever be adopted together. Most families want only 1 or 2 children, the director explained. Keeping 9 together is almost impossible. They will probably be separated into different homes. Those words echoed in David's mind long after he left the building. He could not stop thinking about those 9 pairs of eyes looking at the world with fear and uncertainty. He imagined them growing up apart, losing each other, and carrying the pain of separation. Something inside him resisted that idea. He whispered to himself, "They belong together. They need to stay together." That night, David lay awake in bed, thinking about the weight of such a decision. He was only one man. Raising even 1 child would be a challenge, but 9? People would call him crazy. His friends might laugh. His neighbors might question him. And he himself did not know how he would manage financially. Yet, in his heart, he felt a quiet certainty. Love was not about numbers, it was about commitment. If he could give them a home, a safe place, and the assurance that they were wanted, then perhaps that was enough. The next morning, David made up his mind. He returned to the children's home and asked the director what it would take to adopt all 9 girls. The director stared at him in disbelief. "All 9? That's unheard of. Do you realize how much responsibility that is?" David nodded. "I do. But I also realize what it would mean to them. I can't let them be separated." The process was not easy. Social workers questioned him again and again. They wanted to know about his finances, his home, his ability to provide. Some even doubted his intentions. Why would a single man want to adopt 9 girls? But David answered every question with honesty and patience. He explained that he had no hidden motive, no secret plan. He simply wanted to give them what every child deserved: a stable home and unconditional love. Weeks turned into months as the paperwork was processed. During that time, David visited the girls often. At first, they were shy around him. They had learned not to trust too quickly. When he brought them little gifts, like coloring books or hair ribbons, they accepted them politely but without much emotion. Trust, after all, had to be earned. But David did not give up. He sat with them during story time, read them books, and helped with their homework. Slowly, he saw small changes. A smile here, a laugh there. One of the younger girls began to tug at his sleeve when she wanted attention. Another started asking when he would come back. Piece by piece, the walls around their hearts began to lower. Finally, after many long months, the approval came through. David was granted the right to adopt all 9 girls. It was a day he would never forget. When he arrived at the children's home to take them with him, the girls were gathered at the door with small bags of belongings. Some looked nervous, others curious. They did not fully understand what was happening. But David knelt down in front of them and said softly, "From today, you are my daughters. You are not going to be moved again. This is your forever home." The ride to his house was quiet at first. The girls pressed their faces against the windows, looking at the streets they would now call home. Some whispered to each other, asking questions. When they arrived, David opened the front door and led them inside. The house was modest, not big or fancy, but he had worked hard to prepare it. There were bunk beds set up in the rooms, fresh sheets on every mattress, and a kitchen stocked with food. He wanted them to feel welcome from the very first moment. The girls walked through the house slowly, touching the furniture, peeking into rooms. For them, this was all new. Some were hesitant to believe it was truly theirs. David watched them with a tender heart. He knew it would take time before this house felt like home, but he was ready to be patient. That first night was unforgettable. Dinner was noisy and chaotic, with 9 children passing plates, spilling drinks, and giggling nervously. Afterward, David gathered them in the living room. He told them a bedtime story, his voice calm and steady, and as he looked around, he saw tired eyes softening. Some of the girls leaned against him, as if they were finally allowing themselves to rest. For the first time in a long time, they felt safe. When the lights went out, however, the fears returned. Some of the girls cried quietly into their pillows, afraid that this new life would vanish just like the others had. David, hearing their sobs, went from room to room, sitting beside each bed. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." It was the beginning of a journey filled with challenges and sacrifices. But in that moment, David knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had made the right choice. In the year 1979, against all expectations, he had become the father of 9 daughters. And though the road ahead would not be easy, he believed that love was strong enough to carry them through. When David first brought the 9 little girls home in 1979, he thought the hardest part was over. The long process of adoption, the paperwork, the interviews, and the questions from officials had taken months. But as the front door of his modest house closed behind them, he realized that this was only the beginning of a much greater challenge. The girls, dressed in second-hand clothes and carrying small bags, stood silently in the living room. Some clutched their belongings tightly, others looked around with cautious eyes, and a few stared at David with suspicion. For them, this house was not yet a home. They had been moved from place to place before, and they had learned not to trust too quickly. David felt the weight of their silence. He smiled gently, trying to break the ice. "This is your home now," he said softly. "You don't have to leave again." His voice carried warmth, but the children did not answer. They only exchanged quiet glances, as if waiting to see whether his promise would be true. The first days were the hardest. David had to adjust to a completely new routine. He was only one man, and suddenly he was responsible for 9 young lives. Meals had to be prepared 3 times a day, clothes had to be washed, beds had to be made, and homework had to be checked. His small kitchen became a place of endless activity. Pots clattered, plates piled up, and laughter sometimes mixed with tears. But it was not just about food and laundry. The deeper challenge was emotional. Each girl carried a different story of loss. Some had been separated from siblings, some had seen their parents struggle with poverty, and some had been moved from foster home to foster home, never staying long enough to feel secure. These wounds did not heal quickly. At night, David often heard quiet sobs from the bedrooms. He would gently knock, sit by their beds, and reassure them that they were safe. Sometimes they listened, sometimes they turned away, unsure if they could believe him. The neighbors were not always kind. A single man raising 9 black girls in 1979 was unusual, and not everyone understood his choice. Some whispered, others frowned, and a few openly questioned him. "Why would you do this?" one man asked David at the grocery store. "It's too much for one person." David only smiled and replied, "Because they deserve a family." But the doubt in people's eyes sometimes made the girls feel different, as if they did not belong. David worked hard to protect them from these stares, reminding them every day that they were precious and valued. Money was another constant struggle. David worked long hours at his job, sometimes picking up extra shifts just to cover food, clothes, and school supplies. His paycheck often disappeared quickly, divided among growing needs. He learned to stretch every dollar, cooking large pots of soup, buying shoes one pair at a time, and making small sacrifices for himself so the girls never felt left out. He rarely bought new clothes for himself, but he made sure each child had what she needed. Despite the hardships, David was determined to create a sense of family. He set small traditions to bring them closer. Every Sunday evening, they gathered around the dining table, no matter how busy the week had been. They would share a meal, talk about school, and laugh about small things. David encouraged each girl to speak, even the shyest ones, so they would feel heard and valued. Slowly, the girls began to open up. Still, trust took time. Some of the older girls found it difficult to obey rules. They were not used to having a steady home, and discipline felt strange. One of them once shouted, "You're not my real father," before slamming her bedroom door. David did not respond with anger. He knew the words came from pain, not disrespect. Instead, he knocked gently, waited for her to calm down, and said, "I may not be your father by birth, but I am here for you for life." That patient love slowly softened the walls the girls had built around their hearts. School was another challenge. Teachers were not always prepared to handle 9 sisters in one classroom or spread across different grades. Some of the girls struggled with reading, others with math, and a few battled shyness that made it hard to speak in class. David spent evenings at the kitchen table, going over homework with each one. It was tiring work, but he never gave up. When one of the girls finally brought home her first A on a spelling test, David taped it proudly to the refrigerator. It was a small victory, but for them, it meant everything. The house itself often felt too small. Bedrooms were crowded, with bunk beds squeezed against the walls and little space for privacy. Clothes spilled from drawers, toys were shared, and the bathroom line in the morning felt endless. Yet, the crowded rooms also created laughter, secret whispers, and the bond of sisterhood. The girls began to lean on each other, helping with chores, braiding each other's hair, and comforting one another when memories of the past crept in. Over time, love grew stronger than the struggles. There were nights when the house rang with giggles, when the girls put on little plays in the living room, or when David read stories aloud as they gathered around him like a circle of hope. Those were the moments that made all the sacrifices worth it. Still, life was not perfect. There were setbacks, tears, and days when David felt exhausted. But whenever he thought of giving up, he reminded himself of the promise he had made: these girls would never again face the fear of being unwanted. By the end of that first year together, something remarkable had changed. The girls no longer looked at the house as a temporary place. They began to call it home. They stopped waiting for the day when they would be sent away again. Slowly, they started calling David Dad. The word carried weight, trust, and a sense of belonging. For David, it was the greatest reward of all. The struggles were far from over, but they had begun to walk the path of family. A path built not on blood, but on love, patience, and the unshakable belief that every child deserves a chance to feel at home. When the 9 girls entered their teenage years, life inside the Mitchell household changed in new and unexpected ways. Childhood had its own set of challenges, but adolescence was an entirely different season. It came with new questions, stronger emotions, and the desire for independence. David, who had raised them with steady patience through their early years, now had to face the complex world of teenagers. The once little girls who clung to him for security were now young women, each with her own personality, her own dreams, and her own struggles. Some were shy and gentle, others bold and outspoken. Some wanted to please him at every step, while others pushed against every rule. But David welcomed their growth. He knew that these were signs of life, signs that they were no longer afraid to be themselves. One of the first big challenges was identity. The girls often looked around and realized that they were different from many of their classmates. In school, most of the children came from traditional families: a mother, a father, maybe one or two siblings. But they were 9 sisters, adopted by a single man. Sometimes, classmates teased them or asked questions they didn't know how to answer. "Why do you all live together, or is he really your dad?" Such comments could sting, especially for teenagers who longed to fit in. At home, the girls sometimes asked David tough questions too. "Why did our real parents leave us?" one of them asked late one night. David sat quietly before answering. He never spoke badly about their past, because he wanted them to heal, not to carry bitterness. Instead, he said gently, "Sometimes people struggle with things we cannot understand. But what matters most is that you were never unwanted. You belong here, and you are loved." The words did not erase their pain, but they gave them comfort. School also became more demanding. Homework grew harder, and the girls began exploring subjects that sparked their interests. One of them, named Angela, discovered she had a gift for music. She could play the piano by ear, turning simple melodies into beautiful songs. David, even though money was tight, saved up enough to buy her a used keyboard. When she played, the whole house grew quiet, as if the music wrapped them in peace. Another sister, Tamara, found her talent in running. She joined the track team at school and surprised everyone with her speed. At her first competition, David stood proudly in the stands, cheering louder than anyone. When she crossed the finish line in first place, her eyes searched for him in the crowd, and when she saw him clapping and smiling, she felt something stronger than victory. She felt truly seen. But not every story was filled with joy. Some of the girls struggled with grades, friendships, and self-confidence. One of them, Monique, often brought home report cards filled with low marks. She would lower her eyes, afraid to disappoint David. Instead of scolding, he sat with her, night after night, helping her with reading and math. Progress was slow, but one day she proudly handed him a test with a passing grade. David taped it on the refrigerator just as he had done years before. It wasn't about the grade, it was about her courage to keep trying. Teenage rebellion also made its way into the home. Curfews were tested, rules were questioned, and sometimes voices were raised. One of the older girls once declared, "I'm old enough to make my own choices." David listened, but he also stood firm. "You are free to dream and to decide your path," he said calmly, "but while you are under this roof, I will guide you. My job is to protect you, even when you don't like it." The girl rolled her eyes at first, but years later she would admit that his firmness saved her from mistakes she might have regretted. Despite the arguments and misunderstandings, love always brought them back together. At the end of each conflict, apologies were exchanged, hugs were given, and the bond grew stronger. David never allowed anger to linger. He taught them that families are not perfect, but they stay united through forgiveness and patience. As the years passed, milestones arrived one by one. The first high school graduation was a moment of pure joy. The girl in the cap and gown walked across the stage with her sisters cheering loudly in the audience. David clapped until his hands ached, his heart swelling with pride. For a man who had once been told that adopting 9 children was impossible, this was proof that his decision had been right. Each success felt like a victory for the whole family. When one sister earned a scholarship, they celebrated together with homemade cake. When another won an art contest, her drawings were hung on the walls of their crowded home. When one got her first part-time job, she proudly bought groceries with her own paycheck, smiling as David pretended to protest. But along with triumphs came challenges that tested their strength. Money continued to be tight, especially as the girls grew older and their needs increased. College dreams required tuition, sports required fees, and even simple things like school trips needed money that David sometimes did not have. He worked extra hours, sometimes coming home late at night, but he never complained. His determination showed the girls the meaning of sacrifice. The sisters also learned to lean on each other more than ever. They became each other's best friends, sharing secrets, clothes, and advice. When one cried over a broken friendship at school, another would sit with her, offering comfort. When one struggled with self-doubt, the others reminded her of her worth. Their bond was not just that of sisters by adoption, it was a bond of shared experiences, struggles, and love. Over time, the community that once looked at them with doubt began to see their strength. Teachers, neighbors, and even strangers admired the unity of this unusual family. What once seemed impossible, one man raising 9 girls now stood as a living example of resilience and devotion. By the time the youngest ones entered their teenage years, the older sisters were already becoming role models. They helped with homework, cooked meals when David was working late, and gave advice drawn from their own mistakes and lessons. David often watched them with quiet pride. He knew that his job was not just to raise them, but also to help them raise each other. The growing pains were real: arguments, tears, confusion, and mistakes filled those years. But the triumphs were just as real: graduations, talents discovered, bonds deepened, and dreams nurtured. As David looked around his home in those teenage years, he no longer saw the frightened little girls he had welcomed in 1979. He saw young women standing on the edge of their futures, ready to face the world with courage. His heart swelled with gratitude. The struggles had been many, but each one had been worth it. And though he knew the road ahead would still have its share of difficulties, he also knew something deeper: this family, born from love and choice rather than blood, had grown into, as the years passed, the little girls who once clung to David's side grew into strong, capable young women. The 1990s arrived, and with it came new chapters in their lives. The house that was once filled with toys, school bags, and the chatter of children now echoed with bigger dreams: college plans, careers, and thoughts of building families of their own. For David, watching them step into adulthood was both joyful and bittersweet. He had given his heart and strength to raising them, and now he had to learn the art of letting go. It was not easy. He still saw them as the small children he had first welcomed in 1979, yet he also felt immense pride in the women they had become. The first to leave home was Angela, the girl who had once discovered her gift for music. After finishing high school, she earned a scholarship to study at a university far from home. The night before she left, she sat at the old keyboard, playing a soft melody. The sisters gathered around her, some with tears in their eyes, and David stood quietly, remembering the day he first brought that keyboard home. When Angela hugged him goodbye, she whispered, "I'll make you proud, Dad." And she did. Years later, she became a music teacher, using her talent to inspire children, just as David had once inspired her. Tamara, the runner, also pursued her dreams. She competed in track and field at college and later became a coach for young athletes. Her medals hung proudly in her room, but her biggest joy came from training kids who reminded her of herself, full of energy, yet in need of guidance. She always said that her father's cheering voice at the finish line was what kept her going through the hardest races. Other sisters chose different paths. Monique, who once struggled with grades, worked harder than anyone expected. She studied nursing, determined to help others just as David had helped her. When she graduated in her white uniform, David's eyes filled with tears. He remembered the little girl who had once doubted herself and now stood tall as a woman ready to heal others. Not every path was smooth. Some of the girls faced challenges in relationships, in jobs, or simply in finding their place in the world. There were moments of disappointment, heartbreak, and mistakes. But through it all, David remained their anchor. Whenever one of them stumbled, she knew she could always return home, where her father's quiet wisdom and warm embrace awaited. The sisters also began to support one another in deeper ways. The bond they had built in their crowded childhood home became a source of strength as adults. They called each other for advice, celebrated each other's successes, and rushed to comfort one another during difficult times. Their bond was no longer just about surviving together, it was about thriving together. Family gatherings grew even more joyful as time passed. The dining table that had once been crowded with 9 girls now overflowed with husbands, children, and eventually grandchildren. The house rang with laughter, stories, and the playful cries of little ones. David, now older, would sit at the head of the table, quietly watching as his once small family tree blossomed into something vast and beautiful. One Thanksgiving, the sisters surprised him with a special gift. They had collected photographs from their childhood birthday parties, school graduations, and family trips and placed them into a large album. On the last page, they had written, "For the Father who gave us a home and a future." When David opened it, his eyes filled with tears. He had never raised them for recognition, but in that moment, he realized how deeply his love had shaped their lives. The community that once doubted him began to see his success. Neighbors who had once whispered now admired him. Some even sought his advice on parenting. Teachers, pastors, and local leaders praised the example he had set. David never sought fame, but his story became known in their town, the story of one man who chose love over fear and created a family that defied all odds. The legacy extended beyond his own children. Inspired by their upbringing, several of the sisters entered professions where they could give back. One became a teacher, another a social worker, and another opened a small community center for underprivileged youth. Each of them carried forward the lessons of kindness, discipline, and hope that David had given them. Their children, too, grew up hearing the story of how their mothers had been adopted by one man in 1979. It became part of their family history, a story told at bedtime, at reunions, and at graduations. The grandchildren often looked at David with awe, realizing that without his choice decades earlier, none of them would exist. For David, the greatest joy was not in their achievements, though those were many. His true happiness came from seeing the love they shared. He often said, "Success is not measured by medals or money, but by the kindness you show to others." And in his daughters' lives, he saw proof of that kindness spreading far beyond the walls of their home. The sisters never forgot the sacrifices their father had made. They remembered the nights he stayed up late helping with homework, the mornings he went to work tired after long shifts, and the way he always put their needs before his own. As he grew older and his health began to slow him down, they cared for him with the same devotion he had once shown them. By the time the 2000s came, David was surrounded not just by 9 daughters, but by a growing family tree. Weddings filled the calendar, new babies filled the living room, and family photos grew larger every year. He would often sit back in his chair, watching the joy around him, and think of that day in 1979 when he had opened his door to 9 little girls. He knew then, as he knew now, that it had been the best decision of his life. The legacy of love he created was not just about family. It was about proving that compassion can change the world. His daughters carried that lesson into every classroom, hospital, office, and home they entered. The kindness that began with one man's choice now flowed through dozens of lives, touching people who had never even met him. And so, as the years went on, the Mitchell family's story became more than a story of adoption. It became a story of transformation, of resilience, and of love that stretched across generations. David never considered himself a hero. He often said, I just did what anyone should do when they see a child in need. But his daughters knew better. To them, he was the man who had given them more than a home. He had given them hope, dignity, and the courage to dream. That was his true legacy, a legacy not written in books or headlines, but in the hearts of the people whose lives he had forever changed. 46 years had passed since that day in 1979 when David opened his door to 9 frightened little girls. The world around them had changed in countless ways: new technology, new times, and new challenges, but the bond of family that had been created all those years ago remained stronger than ever. The 9 girls were no longer girls. They were now women in their 50s and 60s, with families of their own. Each had her own story to tell, her own journey of triumphs and trials. Yet whenever they spoke about their lives, they always began with the same truth: it all started with one man's decision to love them. David himself was now an elderly man. His hair had turned silver, his steps were slower, and his voice softer. But his eyes still carried the same kindness that had reassured 9 children decades ago. He now lived in a smaller home, one that was easier for him to manage, but he was never alone. His daughters visited him often, sometimes bringing their children and even grandchildren. The house filled with laughter, the kind of laughter that only comes from generations of love. On his 82nd birthday, the family gathered for a celebration. It was not just a birthday party, it was a reunion of the life he had built. Dozens of people filled the backyard: his 9 daughters, their husbands, their children, and even little great-grandchildren running around. The air was filled with the smell of food, the sound of music, and the warmth of memories. As they sat together, one of the grandchildren asked David a question. "Grandpa, why did you adopt 9 girls all at once? Wasn't it too hard?" David smiled, his eyes twinkling with the wisdom of age. "Yes, it was hard," he admitted. "There were times I was tired, times I didn't know how we would make it. But love makes difficult things possible. I didn't see 9 problems. I saw 9 blessings." His daughters listened quietly, some with tears in their eyes. They had lived through those hard times. They remembered the small house, the crowded bedrooms, the sacrifices he had made. But now, looking around at the beautiful family gathered before them, they saw the truth in his words. What once seemed like a struggle had turned into a legacy. Each daughter had followed her own path. Angela, the musician, had retired after decades of teaching music, but she still played at community events and family gatherings. Tamara, the runner, now coached young athletes, passing on the discipline she had learned in her youth. Monique, the nurse, had spent years caring for patients and now enjoyed mentoring younger nurses. The other sisters had also built lives of purpose as teachers, counselors, businesswomen, and community leaders. Their children had grown into adults who carried forward the same values. Many of them worked in fields that served others: teaching, medicine, social work. Some served in the military, some started small businesses, and some became parents themselves. All of them spoke proudly of their family story. They knew they were living proof of the ripple effect of one man's love. At the birthday celebration, the sisters decided to honor their father in a special way. They had prepared a surprise, a video filled with pictures and short recordings. On a large screen in the backyard, images from the past began to appear: 9 little girls in worn dresses, smiling shyly in front of their new home, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes, graduations with proud smiles, weddings filled with joy. The video ended with a message from all of them: "Thank you, Dad, for choosing us. We are who we are because of you." David wiped his eyes as the video ended. He was not a man who sought recognition, but in that moment, he felt the fullness of what his life had meant. He had once been told it was impossible, that he could not raise 9 children alone. But here, in front of him, stood the proof that love had indeed been enough. As the evening went on, stories filled the air. Each daughter shared a favorite memory: the time David had stayed up all night sewing costumes for a school play, the time he had worked extra hours to buy a prom dress, the way he had always sat in the front row at every event, clapping the loudest. Laughter rang out as they remembered his little sayings, his gentle humor, and even his moments of strictness that had shaped them into disciplined women. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren listened wide-eyed. For them, this was not just family history, it was a lesson in courage and sacrifice. They realized that without their great-grandfather's decision in 1979, their family, their very existence would never have been possible. In the quiet moments after the celebration, David sat on the porch with a few of his daughters. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. One of them asked softly, "Dad, do you ever regret it? Taking in 9 of us all at once?" David shook his head slowly, a peaceful smile on his face. "Not for a single moment," he said. "My life has been rich, not with money, but with love. If I had lived alone, maybe things would have been easier, but they would have been empty. You girls gave me a reason to wake up every morning. You gave me a family. And that is the greatest gift anyone could have." The sisters leaned against him, just as they had done as little girls. For a moment, it felt as if time had folded, and they were children again, safe under his care. In the years that followed, David's health began to decline. Age brought its natural challenges, but he was never without company. His daughters took turns caring for him, cooking his meals, and sitting by his side. They remembered how he had once stayed up late to comfort them, and now it was their turn to return that love. Even in his final years, David remained a symbol of strength and kindness. Whenever he met someone new, a nurse, a neighbor, a friend of the family, he proudly introduced himself as the father of 9 daughters. His story continued to inspire, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was simple and true: one person's choice to love can change countless lives. By 2025, the Mitchell family had grown into something vast. Between daughters, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, there were dozens of people who traced their roots back to David's decision. Family reunions had to be held in large halls, filled with tables, laughter, and stories. And at the center of every gathering was the same message: love is stronger than fear, and family is not defined by blood, but by choice. 46 years after that life-changing day in 1979, the story was complete in the most beautiful way. The 9 girls who had once entered his home as uncertain children were now pillars of strength, wisdom, and love. Their lives, their families, and their legacies were living proof of the power of compassion. And as the family looked forward to the future, they carried with them the lessons David had taught: to be kind, to be brave, and to believe that every child deserves a home. His story would never be forgotten, because it was written not just in words, but in the lives of everyone he touched.